Fritz Haag explores the uses, meanings, and implications of public and private space through community-based projects involving land, animals, architectural structures, and people. His Edible Estates project transformed the front lawns of suburban residences across the U.S. into productive vegetable gardens. Animal Estates, a follow-up project, is composed of habitats for animals displaced by human activity. Animal Estates version 1.0 was first featured in the 2008 Whitney Biennial. In a recent iteration created for the Presidio Habitats project in San Francisco last year, which I should say was developed and coordinated by the Foresight Foundation in Nevada City, California, and Lisa Martin of the Foresight Foundation is here today. For that project, Haag designed Snag Tower, a prototype model home for 6 animal clients that would otherwise live in an ecology based on a standing dead tree. In 2010, Haag was awarded the Prix de Rome, for which he received a fellowship to the American Academy in Rome. I think it fair to say that Haag's work subverts our modern alienation from the environment, our food, and each other. Will you please join me in welcoming Mr. Fritz Haag?
Thanks so much. Thank you. Thanks to Bill and David and Amy and Sarah and the rest of the team for having me back. And how cool to follow the Harrisons. And I studied them in school. And how cool to have a museum that's thinking about the environment. If you can just hold these words in your head while I'm talking, I don't know how much I'll talk about them specifically, but I think it'll be implicit in everything I'm discussing in the work. This idea of designing the wild and cultivating the city, which was my original thought for the talk when I had to give a title 9 months ago, which to me is ridiculous because I usually just want to talk about what I'm interested in today or this morning. So I gave them a new lecture this morning with pictures of things from last week, because that's what I want to talk about. But I'll talk about things, but ultimately the way I organized this talk was geographically by city, selecting a few cities from east to west that I've been working in recently and looking at a spectrum of projects I've been doing in each place, which has been the real challenge of my work, taking these sort of general global ideas and then applying them in very local ways. But when I was organizing the images, I realized 20 years ago I did my first project with plants when I was in college, and this is a project that I did called Spring Eternal, I guess it was called, where I gathered all the trash from the College of Fine Arts, piled it up into this tower, and then planted garlic and onion plants around it. There was originally a reflecting pond, but there was a leak, and it drained into the dean's office. and then it was just plants and no reflecting pool. But it reminded me of a project that I just finished, or just kind of started this past week, just a few days ago, called Composted Constructions, organized by Stroom in Den Haag in the Netherlands. And this project is very similar in a way. I was working with a team there that was gathering junk, discarded domestic objects for a few weeks, gathering them into the shipping container on a site where they're doing a much larger, more ambitious project. And over the course of 2 days, we just workshopped and created things for people, plants, animals, and food that would exist in the site. So this is the Duck Estate, made out of a drum and a chair and a dish rack from a kitchen. But these are all things that anyone could recognize from their own home, that they could imagine or remember throwing away themselves. And on the site would be scattered these very modest installations of these objects repurposed for a very modest activity. For example, this black suitcase, which is now a bat house, and this old kind of, maybe not so old, Swiss sort of cute chair that became a birdhouse. So I'm just at the very beginning of this project, and we were just messing around making these things, which will then be used when it opens in 2 days, I think. Or no, tomorrow it opens. So that's a worm composting unit on a sled. That's my little Joseph Beuys quote there, I guess. But and before I go geographically, I just wanted to give an overview of two ongoing projects. One is Animal Estates that was mentioned. The next edition I'll talk about at the end in London. A series of projects that ask this sort of basic series of questions. Do we want animals in our cities, yes or no? How do we want to accommodate them? And coming from a background in architecture, I've been thinking about them as clients that don't have a voice in the city. And each city I go to, now this being the 8th city, selecting a very specific list of animals that will be our clients that used to live in the city that we might want to welcome back, and then generating projects, designs for them to serve as prototypes that anyone in the city could make for themselves. And this is the one mentioned by the Foresight Foundation that's now in the Presidio. So these projects are meant to be prototypes that anyone could do on their own in the city. And when I start a project, it's a permanent strand of my work that can exist permanently as the opportunity arises. And this is the same with the Edible Estates series. You'll see there's the 12th edition will happen this spring in Budapest. The most recent one I just finished last week in Istanbul. And that project is similar, taking this very general idea of what if people grew food publicly where they live. It's a very simple thought, but it plays itself out very differently depending on what city you go to. What are the opportunities for people to grow food where they live? And if there isn't an opportunity for people to grow food where they live, what does that mean? And each city I go to, I encounter different issues and different issues particular to that place, but there's always the general ones as well. So the stories of the first 8 gardens were compiled into the book. The Edible Estates book that was the new edition came out last year. So these are a few of the projects that I've been doing the last few years, and you'll see how they play themselves out in different cities. And of course, Edible Estates, my dream was to get arrested doing these projects, but I realized it wasn't me that would be arrested, it would be the people I'm doing the gardens with. So I'm happy they didn't, but this woman almost did. I don't know if you heard this story, but this is part of the dialogue now kind of emerging around these projects in the last few years since I started it. Anyway, I grew up in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and I think for me it's been important to now start to think again about how I grew up, because I grew up in a very common situation. This is the house I grew up in. I guess that's my brother and I making snow forts or something. But we had a lawn that's under 3 feet of snow here in a very typical suburban house. And I grew up in what I would consider to be a very typical 1970s situation. This was our community center. This is the first climate-controlled mall in the world. This was my town square. We went there very regularly, at least once a week probably. And I remember very vividly, actually, this bird cage that was in the middle. I don't remember birds there, but this was huge in my psyche. But what I was discovering at my local library were these books by Malcolm Wells, for example, on underground houses or sheltered architecture. And I became totally obsessed with this kind of stuff going on in the 70s, especially in Minnesota. 12 years ago, I moved to Los Angeles for no good reason apart from the sense that I needed to be there for the work that I wanted to do, to deal with the things I wanted to deal with. A relationship between humans and the environment around them, and specifically this more kind of broad general idea that's emerged in my work about how do we collectively, what do we collectively do with the cities, the neighborhoods, the homes we inherit from previous generations. My first days in LA, my first months in LA, I started gardening like crazy, like totally crazy. I became obsessed with gardening. I went to debt gardening, actually, and it became really the foundation of my work. And later in my later garden here at the Dome that I have in Los Angeles. Gardening not just as a way to make pretty places, but gardening as a metaphor for how we behave in the world. And I think I recognized early on gardening, everything we need to know about how to live on this planet in a more thoughtful way we can learn through gardening, and any gardener knows. This is an early project I did in LA, and this was actually with David Walker at Art Center, called the Garden Lab Experiment, where we tried to find everyone dealing with environment and ecology in their work in some way and bring them together for this sort of fair convention sort of thing. Now we'd be hard pressed to like edit it down because the activity in LA, there's so much activity there now. And that later led to these community gardens that I started at all the schools I was teaching at Cal Arts and at Art Center. And then in 2006 was the beginning of, or 2005 was Edible Estates, the beginning of it, and the second garden was in Los Angeles. Now, what I realized doing that second garden in LA, when you're looking at growing food at home where you live publicly, LA and cities like LA have an abundance of possibilities. Usually homes are surrounded by these lawns that have no other function, and it's a very easy reimagining to start to grow food there, and you'll see how that changes radically as I go to other cities. But another huge part of the work that developed when I was in LA was this sort of encampments, colonies, settlements that I was starting to make as short-term projects with my students, which you'll see other versions happening in other cities. But a lot of what I'm interested in is how we self-organize, how a group of people comes together, decides how they want to live, and then form something physical to manifest that desired way of living. And I think all cities start out as encampments. All cities start out as temporary encampments and grow from there. So a lot of my work and a project I'll be doing next term at Princeton with the students there will be making a colony, a settlement for students on the campus, because I'm interested in that primary DNA of how do we want to live. New York City is a project, well, the beginning projects I want to talk about there go back to the Animal Estates, the first edition of Animal Estates that was mentioned in the introduction, which was at the Whitney Museum. And in New York City, it's such a dense environment, especially in Manhattan. When I proposed, or when I started to think about this idea of Animal Estate series of projects, I couldn't imagine any animals that I would want to host at the museum for 3 months in March. So I found the landscape ecologist Eric Sanderson, who I worked with, and we developed he came up with a list of animals that used to live at the corner of 75th and Madison 400 years ago, before Henry Hudson arrived, European settlers arrived 400 years ago. And from those, I selected animals that would move, that we might want to have in the city, that needed architecture, that needed something physically built to accommodate them. So this series of projects evolved first as a series of prototype animal estates that were very publicly displayed on the street, not for the ticket-buying public who's going into the museum, but for the people just walking back and forth on the street. But this first edition of Animal Estates responded to the unique conditions of the Whitney Museum as the instigator for the city of New York. And both of those things were important to the project, and you'll see in a few of the other examples how each city, it becomes a totally different project based on what are the local challenges and what are the local resources. It so happens in New York, I came across this amazing person, Eric Sanderson, to work with, who was a huge inspiration for the project. So the direction of Animal Estates in that city grew almost entirely out of his research, his work that he'd been doing for 10 years into the natural history of the city. So when I approach a new city, it's always with this openness to what's going on there. And then those have since been donated to the Swindler Cove Park, which is at the northern tip of the island of Manhattan. And then the most recent project in Manhattan has been one of the later editions of Edible Estates, where once again I worked with Eric Sanderson. And you'll see the difference between the sort of edible estate I did here, which is radically different than the one in LA. Here, it's not even a proposal for people growing all their own food in the island of Manhattan, because that's not feasible right now. But working with Eric to develop an idea of how people were growing food and eating food out of the island 400 years ago, I created a garden out of only about 20 different plants, all of which the native Lenape were eating from the island 400 years ago. So 3 cultivars, corns, beans, and squash that were grown in these 3 sisters mounds, and then the rest were natives. So the garden doesn't function as a literal place for these residents of this public housing complex to feed themselves, but it is like this portal in time. So every time any kid or anyone passes by the garden, hopefully they have this memory moment like, oh yeah, people used to eat food that came out of this dirt. And even that is important if you can have that moment of recognition. And of course, for the kids that may not ever even otherwise see a zucchini coming off a plant, or a tomato coming from a plant, or corn, which in this case was mostly eaten by squirrels, frankly, and the occasional rat, which is another story. But that moment of recognition and that visibility in the street, because I never intended edible estates to be this panacea, like we're going to solve our world food problems by everyone growing their food at home. The visibility of the project is what was always most important, the fact that you would have this evidence on the street of what food looks like growing on plants. And a later addition in the New York area was planted at the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum in Richfield, Connecticut, just outside of the city, where I worked with the staff of the museum and planted a garden that the staff was tending for themselves to grow their own food on the grounds. And I was also interested in the domestic history of the museum. The museum used to be a house, and then they built this modern wing for the art. But treating this museum as a home, putting the compost pile at the front door of the museum, and having people come in feel like someone's living here, like human beings are here. And I think so rarely do you sense that in a museum today. There's the voice of the institution that's like God. And as much as possible, whenever I'm doing projects in museums, I try to either pitch a tent or start a compost pile or something that will immediately make people feel like humans are here and you're welcome to sit down and hang out. And that's the first point of entry into the project, and whatever happens from there is fine. So here's another one of our settlements. With any project that I do, usually there's a headquarters where there's workshops and talks and activities, and people can check in and spend time engaging with the people there involved that day. And then dance movement has become a huge part of my work. So in the back there was this dancing boardwalk where the rule was you had to do what the person in front of you was doing. So everyone's a follower and everyone's a leader. So this project at the Aldrich Museum was really this kind of survey of kind of all these different series of work that I've been doing, presented all simultaneously. And these are the estates for the flying squirrel. And then a later colony or settlement in New York was this kind of, I kind of put my wacky hippie East Side LA environment into the middle of Chelsea and installed all these geodesic domes that were then open call that could be colonized by anyone in the city. Moving on to London, which was the site of the 4th edition of the Edible Estates series, and also into an urban environment that's become extremely interested in food and where it's coming from, and with public green space. The location for this garden was in one of the least green parts of the city in Southwark, commissioned by Tate Modern, and this is just south of Tate. So this garden is a communal garden, not a community garden. There's no private plots. It's all tended communally by the residents, the council housing estate residents that look down on it. So this garden and all the gardens are intended to be permanent. I do go through a great deal of effort to identify people and places where the garden's going to have the best chance to be around for a while. And the show at Tate lasted, I don't know, 3 months, but the garden continues 4 years later, and every time I'm in London, I go and visit and see how it's doing, and there's an ongoing relationship I have with them. So for example, when I was there last week, I took pictures and I met with Denise, who's like the kind of backbone of the garden and has been from the very beginning. And I'll actually be doing, as a part of the Serpentine Gallery, they do a series of marathon conversations every year during Freeze. So I've invited Denise to come and participate in that with me in a couple weeks, where it's Garden Marathon this year. So I'll be interviewing Denise, who, when we started the garden, she was extremely depressed and unemployed, and now works for the nonprofit that originally I worked with on the garden. As you know, quite literally, gardening has changed her life, and part of what I'll be interested in with this interview with her is to find out about her daily life in the garden, which has a life way beyond my initial work with it. And then, this is a very strange thing, but last year Boris Johnson, the mayor of London, launched an edible estate competition and they awarded like a prize for the best edible estate in the city. And I think something important to note about these gardens is I work with the residents, we plant something, we design something, over 3 days, very chaotically, very intensely, and then I'm out of there. And I try to remove myself as much as possible so that it becomes clear it's not my garden, it's their garden, and they're meant to step in and take ownership of it. And the next project in London will be opening next week, I guess, in a week and a half. It'll be the next edition of Animal Estates at Arup, the global planning engineering firm. So what we'll be doing is creating a new headquarters for urban wildlife client services. So now you go into Arup, there's this really fancy reception area on the left. We're going to create an identical reception area on the right out of salvaged junk. And that's going to be the reception area for animal clients. So when you go into Arup now, they have 100 offices around the world and 10,000 employees or something. You go into their corporate headquarters now, and next week it'll be human clients on the left and animal clients on the right. And in that headquarters for animal clients will be workstations for the 11 animal clients we've selected. These are a few of them. A conference room, a library, and a headquarters for activity of all different kinds, presenting local projects that are going on. In this case, here's the hedgehog. But we very strategically selected 11 local animal clients that used to live in London that we might want to welcome back with some sort of architecture, and then working with a lot of local partners to turn this headquarters into a local resource. Rome is the city I've been living in the past year while at the American Academy. I lived in Italy for a few years in my 20s. I studied architecture there. But the real revelation for me about Rome this year has been going back, 2,000 years to the Roman Empire and understanding the story of a city of 1 million people that needed to feed itself. And the real story of ancient Rome was a story of a city that was so hungry and so big and so dense that it couldn't feed itself. So the story of the Roman Empire is a story of a city just feeding itself, and the perimeter of the empire is the perimeter of grain production and food production and seafood coming from Britannia and all that. So we understand that the story of food miles is not modern. It's the story of big cities. Anyway, while I was at the academy, I had this rooftop terrace. So I gathered any junk I could find at the academy and slowly developed this garden over the year, a very modest garden that anyone could do on their own with what they would scavenge around the city. And it evolved over the course of the year. And the great irony of these edible estate projects is the previous years I was out in my garden every day, and now I get to garden like 6 days a year because I'm just always traveling, and I only get to garden when I'm doing one of these gardens in a city. But it was a great pleasure at least to have this time every day out in this garden messing around, like making these little kind of hot houses. So we'd cover the plant with the bottle if it was cold out, and then flip it to gather water when it was warm and you wanted to gather water, for example. But it was an opportunity for me just to be outside every day and messing around with plants and cast off trash to see what was possible for, in that case, what's uniquely possible in Rome, which people don't have front lawns in Rome, of course. They have maybe a little terrace. So what I'm interested in with each city is what's uniquely possible in that place. And then it was a crazy thing. It snows in Rome every 10 years, and it snowed when I was there, and we had 2 nights of frost. So I brought everything in and made this cute little hothouse in my window where all my plants lived for 2 days. Alice Waters took over the kitchen at the Academy a few years ago, and my greatest moment of pride is when a few of the cooks from the kitchen came up to start harvesting my lettuce because mine was doing better than theirs, because their garden in back was getting frost and mine wasn't. So one project that I started while in Rome is a new book called Rome Eats Rome, Roma Mangia Roma, which is a series of interviews with 30 people that live in the city right now, of 5 generations. People in their 90s, little kids in their teens, to find out how they're eating. Using food as a lens to understand larger stories about how things are changing, not just how the city of Rome is changing, but how our relationship to food is changing, and Rome is a great place to see that. Oh, and then by the way, the garden, I didn't throw it away. I donated it to a local community center that picked it up on my last day at the Academy, and they hauled it away to this community center for immigrants and unemployed people. Now, this looks like it's rural, but this is in the center of Rome, next to Termini, an abandoned factory called Snia. So again, I love the idea that anytime I go to Rome, hopefully in 10 years, I can go back and see that garden growing. One of the people I did an interview with for this book I mentioned is Gianfranco Baruchello, who wrote a book called How to Imagine that I've been carrying around for 3 years, and finally I had a chance to read it in Rome. And it's this amazing story of a farm he started north of Rome in 1973. He got fed up with the city, moved north, got this land, started squatting on it, and thought of this farm as a work of art. There you can see him with Marcel Duchamp. So other people I interviewed was just this broad cross-section of people, through friends, through connections, however we could do it, to find different stories, different points of view. So I think what I'm going to do, I obviously didn't time this properly. I know. So I think I did my math wrong. So I'll just end with a few quick shots of Istanbul, because that's where I wanted to end, actually. But the last garden is this hothouse on a roof of an art institution in Istanbul that just opened a few weeks ago, where it's a headquarters for local urban gardening groups to start seeds and to meet and to gather. Anyway, sorry I went over. Thank you.